particulars is manifested. The most interesting feature of this aspect of the speculative theory of judgment is that Hegel does explain why this necessary denotation of distinct spaces could not be made by using the terms referring to the fundamental concept determinations. One could argue that, at least with respect to the terms subject and predicate, they are superfluous, and that the denotation of distinct spaces could be made by simply using the terms universal, individual, and common. That is, that we do not need the terms subject and predicate. The reason why this cannot be the case is that the self-subsistent elements are inherently totalities, which means that each space in the judgment logos must accommodate and exhibit each and every fundamental concept determination. Imagine the individual occupying a space and the universal another in the judgment logos, and then each of them transforming itself into the other. The individual is now the universal, and the universal the individual. Were these determinations absolutely identical or fixed with the spaces they occupy, there would be no connection between the initial judgment, the individual is the universal, and the one that has emerged from its transformation, namely, the universal is the individual. In fact, it would be impossible to say that the individual transformed itself into the universal. It would seem that we are talking about four distinct elements, two universals and two individuals. To specify self-transformation in this instance is to refer to a change within the same space, which would be a space whose sole inhabitant at the given first moment is a certain fundamental concept determination and its connotations. Since A, this specific space is the sole space under consideration, B, its sole inhabitant at the given first moment is a certain fundamental concept determination, and C, all change happens within this space, it must be the case that any new content is a self-transformation of that fundamental concept determination. It is for this reason that the notions of subject and predicate and copula are here employed. They have namely the function of being tags that each time delimit the same space in the judgment logos. The German text hier, nun doch bei dieser Veränderung ihrer Bestimmungen die Seiten des Urteils auf eine allgemeine Weise festzuhalten, sind, das heißt Subjekt und Prädikat, am dienlichsten, die sich dann gleich bleiben. So these notions fix and make visible the spaces in which the concept's transformation occurs. The self-subsistent elements are totalities, and as such, any of their members will occupy an empty space at any given moment. By using the terms subject and predicate as tags, we achieve two things. First, we allow the possibility that each time a different concept determination will occupy the same space in the judgment logos, that is to say, we do not rigidly identify, we do not fix a space with the concept determination that occupies it. And second, we can observe the different manifestations of the concept in the judgment logos itself. There is a final step in this argument which I will not take in the present table. It explains that the notions of subject and predicate can play the role of a tag because they have the nature of a name, as was previously mentioned. Next, Hegel goes on to develop a mini theory of the name and show why and how subject and predicate fit into that theory. On the whole, subject and predicate are fixed spaces in the judgment logos. This goes against those who characterize the subject as essentially that about which something is said, and the predicate is essentially that which is said about the subject. For in this trivial characterization, the necessary link between them, on the one hand, and the specific nature of the externalized concepts, on the other, is not made explicit. The judgment, as the quintessential logos of the determining concept, should manifest the totalitarian nature of its self-subsistent components. It is for this reason that what constitutes these extremes, namely subject and predicate, must have essentially the character I have just specified. Indeed, without this character, the two sides of the judgment will never be able to manifest immanently each and every fundamental concept determination. As Hegel puts it, quote, it is exactly significance of the two sides of the judgment that takes place under the names subject and predicate. End of quote. As explained, the judgment is characterized in terms of three basic features or functions: unity, self-subsistence, and totality. At the beginning of the dialectic, however, it is self-subsistence that dominates the judgment logos for the simple reason that the first positive of judgment gives rise to a context of immediacy. In such context, the distinctness and therefore self-subsistence of the elements becomes so powerful and extreme that it causes the suppression of the other two functions. True, subject and predicate appear as united through the copula, but this unity, due to its immediate existence, hypostatizes itself and becomes a third entity, the copula as such. Its character of universality is suppressed in favor of the particularity of the elements. Tonality, too, vanishes, for each of the constant determinations acquires a fixity that prevents it from turning itself into the others. The only explicit state of affairs the immediacy of the beginning allows is a side-by-side arrangement, an external connection, a verbindung of the fundamental constant determinations. This initial explication of the judgment appeals especially to representative thinking, to the so-called common sense, for which the isolated identity of subject and predicate constitutes their very essence. Das aber der Begriff Immutheit als Erscheinung ist, mit dem seine Momente darin Selbstständigkeit erlangt haben, an diese Seite der Persönlichkeit hält sich mehr die Vorstellung. The subject is given the status of an element that could exist even if it were not related to a specific predicate. The predicate, the status of an element that could exist even if it were not related to a specific subject. It is the universal determination, which despite being related to a specific subject, is independent from it. It has a life of its own, a life that goes beyond its particular instantiation. This universal determination is first and foremost an idea in one's head, not an inherent characteristic of the thing itself. But then, thirdly, since representationalism and common sense begin from the assumption that subject and predicate are primordially distinct, it is not surprising that they characterize their connection in the judgment in terms of externality and subjectivity. For them, then, the judgment is nothing but a verbindung, a Zusammenbindung, a synthesis of two originally non-connected elements, a universal determination that is in my head, and an immediate existence, a thing that lies outside of my head. Hegel calls this connection the subjective unity of the judgment, and describes it as follows, quote, with the judgment there arises, therefore, the reflection whether this or that predicate, which exists in one's head, could and should be associated with the object, which has an independent existence outside it. The act of judgment itself has this character, that it is only through it that the predicate is first put together, verbunden, with the subject, so that if such putting together, verbunden, did not take place, each of subject and predicate will remain what it is for itself. The first an existing object, the second a representation in my head. End of quote. This subjective unity, which representationalism and common sense take to be an absolute truth, is a direct corollary, direct consequence of the structure of the context of immediacy in which the judgment is initially manifested. But since the judgment is the determinate expression of the concept itself, that subjective unity is destined to be sublated in the dialectic, as soon as the objective, namely original unity of the concept determinations, arises out of its implicitness and becomes explicit. Indeed, in truth, the predicate is not external to the subject to which it relates. It arises in the universe of discourse together with the subject. Its existence is intrinsically bound to that subject. The context of immediacy suppresses the expression of this intrinsic unity, but the latter must nonetheless appear Hence, the tension at the beginning of the dialectic of volcano ready to erupt. It is not as if we have a choice to satisfy ourselves with the subjective unity of the judgment and decide to remain eternally captives of representationalism and common sense. The very logical structure of the judgment requires that this subjective unity unsettles and transforms itself or returns into the objective unity. This state of affairs entails that representationalism and common sense, as corollaries of the context of immediacy in which the judgment is initially manifested, are not foreign to the concept itself. It is in fact its own existence that begins with their presence. They are therefore part of the life of the concept, and the dialectic that follows must show how the explicit presence of the subjective unity of the judgment, which they exemplify, returns into the explicit presence of the objective unity, the original unity of the fundamental concept determinations. So, in general, Hegel objects to the idea that the predicate is attached to the subject because he thinks that speculative logical theory has proven the emergence of the judgment from the concept itself, the single character of the subject matter. Thus, the differentiated elements we observe in the judgment logos are externalizations of the concept, and therefore are bound together not a posteriori, but primordially. And yet, the immediacy of the initial proceeding of the judgment destroys, as it were, that initial proof and demands a return to it. This is why subjectivity A is incorporated and B has to be sublated in the sphere of the judgment. So subject, predicate, and copula are then spaces that accommodate the fundamental concept determinations. And initially, these determinations appear explicitly as self-subsistent elements. Yet in its very self-subsistence, each of the determinations has its own peculiar character, which it has received from the internalization of the concept's abstraction, a theme developed in the previous macro category of the pure concept. What is significant regarding these various characters is that their coexistence in the judgment logos requires the necessary development of a system of perspectives or standpoints, and the judgment's development in the context of immediacy exactly in terms of that system. To begin with, recall that the self-subsistent element in the subject space is the immediate individual, which, despite the fact that it appears to be connected to universal characteristics, has an independence from them. In fact, from its own standpoint, the immediate individual is what is essential in the relation, in the sense that removal of the predicate will still leave us with what there is in truth. But then, from its own standpoint, in this very relation, the abstract universal is necessarily the inessential element in the judgment logos, and therefore is not self-subsistent. This is so because A, the existence of the judgment requires the presence of both of their latter, and B, the immediate individual is posited as not requiring a connection to the universal. Since the connection does exist, and since the individual is allegedly truly self-subsistent, it has to be the case that the universal is dependent upon the individual, that it is the reason why there is such a connection. The individual, that is, does not need the universal for the realization of its existence, that the universal must inhere in the individual if it is to have reality and truth. Yet, on the other side, the abstract universal, which has proven to be the self-subsistent element in the predicate space, has an independence from the immediate individual, despite the fact that it appears to be connected to it. So, from its own standpoint, the abstract universal is what is essential in the relation, in the sense that removal of a specific individual will still leave us with that universal. That is to say, the existence of the universal characteristic does not depend upon any